Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to part 2 of my mini-series on the isolated Queen's Pawn. At the end of the last video in this series, I had an interesting position on the board that one of the viewers asked a question about, so I wanted to briefly return to that before I get on to some new games. So this was the game Penrose-Nilsson, and Penrose played h4 here. And Nilsson responded with bishop f8. But there's an interesting question, which is why not just take that pawn? It's got two pieces on it and only one defending it. So what happens if we play bishop takes h4? So the answer is, and the reason why I especially wanted to return to this, and I appreciate the comment from my viewer, is that there's a very typical counter thrust here in cases where you have the isolated queen's pawn and it hasn't been blockaded, which is to push on with d5. Now this is not technically an isolated queen's pawn because already the b pawn has been brought to c3, so it's part of a pawn duo now. But still, the idea is the same. If you can, if you have the ability to push on with d5, it's something you should always check out, and it's just working for you tactically in this position. So it's a good move here. If you want to take a second and figure out the tactics behind why it works, it might make a good tactical exercise. Okay, I'm going to start talking about it. So you play d5 here, and there's basically two responses. One is you can either take the pawn or you can move the knight away so it doesn't get captured. And first of all, you can rule out taking the pawn because rook takes rook check, the queen takes back, and then this bishop is left hanging. The queen's doing two jobs. It's defending the rook and it's defending the bishop, and it can't do both of them. So pretty quickly we can rule out pawn takes pawn, but what about knight to a5? And there's another interesting idea here, which is bishop to b5. So this pawn is chased away, a key defender of this diagonal, and this rook here, especially with this bishop here, has no good squares. If it comes forward, then that leaves this bishop hanging. So, and if it goes sideways, it gets taken by this bishop. So black is going to lose the exchange at best. And if black tries to block with this bishop, then once again white can trade and pull the queen away from its job of defending the bishop on h4, and white picks up a piece. So white wins material in every line after d5. Pretty interesting note on that last game. Okay, let's take a look at the first game from for this video, the first new game. This game was played between Paul Joner with the white pieces and Karl Kuhlberg with the black pieces. Paul Joner was a Swiss player, many-time Swiss champion, and Karl was several-time Swedish champion. So we have a clash of champions here. Let's watch how it starts. Paul Joner kicks off with d4. We get knight f6. And now knight f3, a way of avoiding the Nimzo-Indian, although you'll see that we actually transpose back into it in a move or two. After c4, e6, c4, bishop to b4 check, the Bogo-Indian. White plays here the move knight c3. There are other moves which keep it in Bogo territory, but knight c3 just transposes back into a Nimzo-Indian. Black continues with c5. White shores up the center with e3, and there's this exchange. And then black plays d5, just going after the center. White ignores this and plays bishop to d3, just getting about with his development. And after this exchange, d takes, bishop takes. We get this classical queen's gambit, this classical isolated queen's pawn position. And this position we're going to look at several times in this video. I think all the games start from this position, or one very similar to it. This can arise from different openings. As we saw, it came from the Bogo-Indian. It can also come directly from the Nimzo-Indian, and also from the Rogozin variation of the queen's gambit declined. That's you play a queen's gambit declined, and then instead of putting the bishop on e7, you move it all the way out to b4 there. And that's the Rogozin variation. So a lot of different games have been played from this position, and it shows pretty characteristic features of the isolated queen's pawn. A lot of different possibilities can occur from here, as we will see. So black castles and white castles. Actually, I guess it's this position here after the castling that we will look at in the rest of the video. So b6. Just preparing to fianchetto the queenside bishop. The queen goes to e2. Staying in touch with this bishop over here, which can come under fire on the c-file. We'll see something like that happening. Bishop to b7, getting up to the light squared diagonal here. Bishop to g5, coming out and pinning this knight. And now bishop takes c3, so Kohlberg voluntarily decides to give up the bishop pair in exchange for inflicting this pawn on c3 on white. And this pawn is a bit of a problem. It can't be supported by other pawns, so it's a bit of a backwards pawn, although it can move forward, and we'll see that in some games. Let's see. Black continues the knight bd7. We get rook to c1, defending that pawn in advance. Queen to c7, preparing to pile up pressure on the c-file. And now the bishop voluntarily drops back to this diagonal. Doesn't have to move because it's defended by the queen, but this is a good diagonal for the bishop, and we'll see it doing something on that diagonal later. So pawn to h6, kicking the bishop. This bishop drops back to d2. And now rook a to d1, just centralizing the rooks. And let's see, we continue rook f to e1, rook f to e8, and now bishop to b1. So this bishop drops all the way back. It went like this. The idea is to stay out of the way of the rooks and also to allow the queen to come here and pile up for a battery, maybe threaten checkmate on h7 if the opportunity arises. Black has an interesting maneuver in response. Black starts with queen d6. Now white moves the rook to the d-file, and then the queen comes forward to d5. So setting up a battery here, looking at g2, keeping this knight momentarily restrained. The bishop develops to f4, and the queen switches to the king side. And this is Black's idea. He's got pressure on this knight. And right here, White pushes on with c4. So this is really the position I wanted to get to. As I mentioned this a couple times in the previous video, this is called the hanging pawns. So after the trade of the piece on c3, bringing a pawn to defend the d-pawn, that pawn comes forward, creating a situation where these two pawns, they don't support each other. They're side by side, and they're not supported by pawns on either side. So that's why they're called hanging pawns. They're just kind of suspended in midair. And Black can get counterplay against them. He can line up his pieces and go after those pawns. So they are a weakness that needs to be defended by pieces. But on the other hand, they have some strengths. One is they control all of these squares in front of them. So these knights are not easily hopping into the game. Not there. The knights are not easily hopping into the game because those squares are controlled. So it keeps Black's pieces under some kind of restraint. And then secondly, these pawns are very mobile, or flexible, maybe is a better word. Either one can go forward, depending on the circumstance. The d-pawn can push forward to d5, or the c-pawn can push forward to c5, depending on whether it's which one looks more useful. If you want to disrupt the queenside pawns, or disrupt the center pawns, or open up spaces for your pieces. So you have that flexibility there with this configuration. Okay, the game continues knight f8. This knight is coming over to the king side, and it's getting out of the way of the rooks, so the rooks have a clear view of the pawns. Queen comes up to e3, knight to g6. Bishop drops back to g3. Black doesn't really want to trade off that bishop just yet, although it does get traded off eventually. But White here, Black here unleashes his plan, which is to take advantage of the pressure on the knight here and inflict some pawn damage on White. Notice the White takes back with the pawn, keeping the queen on the board. So he's got the queen, he's got the two bishops and the two rooks, and he really wants to take advantage of the open lines created by those doubled pawns and try and get some kind of attack going. And let's see, knight h4 was played, putting immediate pressure on the f-pawn. Rook to d3 defending. Now rook to c8. These rooks reorganize themselves. That's hitting the c-pawn, which needs to be defended. And then the other rook comes over to the d-file. And so we have kind of the ideal setup from Black's point of view of pressure against those hanging pawns, trying to keep them restrained and forcing White to tie up some pieces to defend them. And at the same time, Black's got some pressure over here. So Black is really doing fine here. I guess the position is really about even, but this move rook c to c3 is a bit of a mistake for White. and black has a good response to that. So actually, I'll go ahead and put it on the board. If you want to take a second and see if you can figure out what black should play here. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. The answer is b5. Just undermining the hanging pawns and, if possible, opening up the square d5 for the knight so that the knight can hop in here and fork the queen and the rook. And so that's why this particular placement of the queen and the rook was a bit unfortunate right at this point in the game. And b5 would have been a good way to continue. That's not how the game went. I just wanted to show this idea because it's important for black to try and undermine those hanging pawns in some way. So like I said, if this pawn takes or if it goes forward, then we get knight to d5 forking. So that wins material for black. Best play would continue with this exchange here first. Get the queen to the h4 square and then pushing on with d5. And after this trade here, pawn takes, rook to d4 hitting the queen, white tries to get the pawn back, but actually black can stay a pawn up in this line and go for an endgame. So rook here gets the pawn, but then after the trade, then knight here, or rook here. No, knight takes. And this is a position which is a little bit better for black. Black has the extra pawn. White has the bishop, which is sometimes good in the endgames, but probably a difficult endgame for white to try and hold. So advantage to black there. Kohlberg missed this chance. He played knight f5, harassing the queen, and now the queen lines up behind the isolated, not the isolated pawns, the hanging pawns, in particular with the idea of pushing the d pawn forward. Black starts to prepare for that, but white pushes on with d5 immediately. And now we get this transformation where we no longer have the hanging pawns, we're back to an isolated pawn. But this is a different one. This is not like the isolated queen's pawn where it's restrained. This is an isolated pawn which is passed, and that can be a real strength of the endgame if white can hold on to it. And so now the struggle will revolve around whether this pawn can be maintained and what advantage white can get from it versus if black can counterattack it somehow. So rook c to d8 was played, piling up immediately, and then pawn to d6, pushing it forward where it's supported by the bishop, queen, and rook. So it's defended at the moment. Unfortunately, this bishop here is under attack, so it's a bit tricky. But, well, black will have to give up the knight to take that bishop, and that's what happens in the game. He immediately goes after the defender. So at this point, this pawn is still defended. I guess the other point I wanted to make here is that this advanced pawn also severely limits black's piece mobility. These pieces are tied down, blockading that pawn, and they really have nowhere to go from there. So it's kind of a tough situation for black, although technically it appears that black is still okay. But certainly white has the greater freedom of movement with his pieces. Queen to e5 was played, coming over here and threatening to win the pawn. And then a very interesting defense was played, just rook to d4. And this indirectly defends this pawn. It defends it through a tactic. So if you want to put on your tactics hat, see if you can figure this position out. Why cannot black take that pawn on d6? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. That subtle move, rook to d4, opened up this diagonal for the bishop, and the bishop is now covering the h7 square, so this king has no escape from the back rank. So because of the back rank problems, it's not safe to take. If let's erase those arrows. If black were to take here, white would just take back, and after exchanging everything on d6, this rook would come in here to c8 check, and that would be devastating. So it's actually winning for white here. If rook takes, white can just take the rook, and black can't really take back at all. So he just loses a piece there. So instead, the move king to f8 was played to solve that problem. Now f4, kicking the queen, not giving him time to grab the rook. Queen drops back to grab the pawn. Queen drops back to e6, and now rook to e3, hitting the queen again, and the queen ran to h3. So this was actually the mistake that makes black worse. The way that black can survive this position is he can actually now liquidate and grab the pawn. What he gets is he gets 2 rooks for the queen, and he also gets a pawn. So rook takes d6, rook takes e6, getting the queen, rook takes d4. Now the queen has to step aside away from the 2 rooks, and that gives black time to grab the second rook. So it's a queen and a bishop versus 2 rooks and a knight, and black does have an extra pawn, but this pawn on a light square is going to come under fire from the queen and the bishop, and it's restrained there. So this is about an even position, actually. There's sometimes when sometimes when the 2 rooks can overpower the queen, but this doesn't appear to be one of them. So that would have been best play and led to an even game. Instead, the queen ran away, maybe with ideas of attacking. Oh, here. The queen went to h3, maybe with ideas of attacking on the king side. But, it doesn't appear that there's ever time for that. The rook goes to e7. And I did investigate this a little bit. If the knight comes in here to g5, it might look a bit threatening at first, but notice that the queen is defending the f2 square, so actually there's no mate here. And after this trade, say queen comes here, check, chasing the king around. This looks dangerous. It looks like the queen maybe can come here and then take that pawn supported by the knight, but there's no time because this rook is threatening to take here with which would be mate. So the rook has to take back, and now this bishop comes out hitting the knight. And through all of these complications, white emerges a little bit ahead. So actually, I'm not sure the knight has a good move here, and the queen maybe has trouble getting out of the corner. So if there's no mating attack here, if the queen just comes up to g7, the bishop is going to take the knight. So there's no time to grab that f2 pawn or get the pieces coordinated on it. So interestingly, the counterattack from black doesn't work in this case. So in this case, black just dropped the knight back and putting more pressure on that d6 pawn. So white plays rook to e5. He's going to give up that pawn, but he's going to get some compensation here. He's going to try and bring the rook over here to harass the queen. g6 was played to try and control some of these squares, and now f5 breaking through. The queen comes back to defend, and then rook to h4. This rook comes over to harass the queen. Now finally, rook takes d6. Black finally grabs that pawn, but it's too late. Now it may look safe at first because the queen is hanging over here, but white's queen is hanging too. But there's a clever way out for black. Black takes here with check, and of course if white takes with check. If black takes back with the rook, then queen takes rook is good. So king takes, and then queen here check, getting out of the glare of the rooks and with tempo, so this queen is still hanging. So black is just losing here. He tried rook here. It's kind of an interesting tactical sequence, giving up this rook so that the queen can come back to the back rank and deliver this check. The king ran to h2, and now the queen can grab the bishop, but the rook can come up here and grab the pawn. And let's see, black doubles on the back rank, going for the counterattack still, but this pawn cancel that. What was played here? Rook to h8 check first, driving the king forward. The king goes to e7, and now this pawn is taken off with check. The king takes the pawn, and now the queen can come in, chase the king around. The king goes to f6, rook to f8, and the king goes to g5, and after queen to e5 check, black resigned. There's just no way out. In fact, everything leads to a mate if you want to try and work out some of the mating ideas here. Of course, the queen interpose is a problem where, it's a case where the white rook can just take the queen and white can win by force of material, but it turns out there's also a mate after a pawn to f4, driving the king here, and then queen to e2 there, mate. So interesting mating patterns here. Of course, if the king runs to the h file, then the rook comes over and mates. And if the king goes this way, we have the queen coming forward, and again a mate on the back rank. So there's just no escape here, and black resigned. So pretty interesting game. Let's take a look at the next one. So this next game was played between Laszlo Szabo and Emilis Melngalis. Anyway, hard to pronounce name there. Played in Kemeri in 1939. I think that's in Turkey. Laszlo Szabo, you may know from my series on the Zurich 1953 tournament. He was one of the participants in that game. He has the white pieces here, and if we go up to move 7 here, or 8, yeah, 9, here we go. Here's the isolated queen's pawn position, same as the previous game, and it continues along in a similar vein for a while. This may have been a standard pattern in those days. b6, queen e2, bishop b7. It's pretty logical, putting the bishop on this file. Rook to d1, putting the rook behind the isolated queen's pawn. The queen goes over to c8, stepping out of the glare of the rook. Bishop to g5, bishop to a6. Now this is interesting. Try to trade off the light squared bishop, which is actually a pretty good piece with the isolated queen's pawn structure. Notice the bishop is supported by the knight and the queen there. Szabo doesn't want to go for the trade and plays knight to b5 instead. So now knight to d5 is played, and this pawn is securely blockaded, at least for the moment. Rook a to c1, getting the rook on the open file next to the isolated queen's pawn and taking a look at the queen there. Queen goes over to b7 so as to stay in touch with the bishop. It's beginning to look a little bit awkward for black over here, but I'm not sure there's anything great that can be done. Laszlo continues with queen e4. The knight comes to d7. And now the pressure, when the queen moved, the pressure was taken off of this bishop here, so this knight was free to move. And now a3, kicking the bishop back. And instead of trading this, oh, that's right, there's no knight on c3 to trade this time, so the bishop drops back to e7, and we get this trade with the dark squared bishops. And the knight takes back. Now notice the dark squared bishop is the bishop that sits behind the isolated queen's pawn a lot of times. So, or maybe it can be active out here on this diagonal, but sometimes it's not the most useful piece, so it can often be a good idea to trade off that dark squared bishop. So the queen dropped back to e1. Bishop takes b5 was played, giving up the bishop for the knight, but that bishop didn't seem to have many squares, so giving it up for the knight was a reasonable move. Knight to f6 now. Cancel that. Knight to f6, sorry. Queen to e2. A little bit of maneuvering here. a6, kicking the bishop. Bishop drops back to d3. This is probably the diagonal it wants to be on anyway. And now knight e to d5. So black has done a good job here of securely defending the d5 square and now blockading it, so that d4, d5 pawn push has never happened in this game. And it doesn't look likely to happen, but I'll just stay tuned. Let's see. Szabo plays g3. That keeps the knight from hopping into this f4 square, which could be annoying. And now b5, taking some more squares away from this bishop. Rook to c5, though. It gave up the c5 square, and now the rooks can possibly double on the c file. Rook a to c8, rook d to c1. So they do double, but black can trade them off at any time. Knight to d7. Sorry, it's black's turn. Knight to d7. This knight was brought over to harass the rook, and there's a little tactic here. So there's a little tactical quiz for you. See if you can spot the tactic for white. Okay, it's kind of a cute one. You know, you might be thinking about this bishop takes h7 sacrifice, which actually this is what was played, but not with the idea of sacrificing the bishop, because in this case, if the king takes, the knight comes in. It just doesn't lead to a whole lot. And of course, this rook is hanging here. But now the problem is that if the king takes the bishop, the queen can come over here with check, and it's a double attack. The queen is hitting the king, and all three pieces are lined up on this rook. So the rook that was securely defended there suddenly is undefended. That actually wins a piece. So in this game, after bishop takes h7, king to h8 was played. Otherwise, you lose a piece. And now white doesn't have a whole lot here, but just goes ahead and trades off and plays the rest of the game a pawn up. So rook takes, queen takes. So it just shows how you gotta you always have to be aware for those little tactics. And after queen c2, he has to defend that bishop or retreat it, but he's going for the endgame directly. We get in this endgame with a bishop and knight against a knight and a knight. White has a weakness. He's taken this isolated queen's pawn all the way to the endgame, but he doesn't mind giving it up in a sense because he's won a pawn over here. And also he uses the isolated queen's pawn in the endgame, and I thought that was what was interesting about this particular game, is how it can be used. So I want to step forward. There's a lot of maneuvering with the pawns and the pieces. The kings come into position in the center of the board, and this bishop gets on a good diagonal in front of that, in front of the pawn, and keeping pieces from landing in front of it. But it gets chased away, and after a little bit more maneuvering, we get to a position which seems kind of blocked up, and you might wonder how white can ever make progress here. But he comes up with a clever idea. His king actually just penetrated here. This was an important step. If you can bring your king in, it can help. He's got control of the square in front of the pawn right now. So let's see if we back up. Was there a way to prevent that? Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's keep going. The knight maneuvered around and attacked that pawn, and the king came over to defend it. So white is holding on to everything so far, but in this position here, black is holding on to everything so far, but in this position here, white finally has got everything organized to play that pawn break, or that pawn push of d5. And I just wanted to show how that can be effective even in an endgame. After all of this maneuvering, finally the knight and the bishop are both pointing at that square, and black does not have a piece there. Actually, if he were to place a piece there, it would get snapped off. So this dancing knight that put pressure on the queenside pawns and pulled the king away and then landed back here seems to have been the final maneuver that caused the position to break down and allowed white to push on with d5. And now after the exchange, knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes. The knight does not, this is important, the knight does not take the d-pawn here. It takes the f-pawn. And the idea is this king in the center can perfectly well stop this pawn from advancing, but this majority over here on the king side, away from where black's king is going to win the game. And in fact, the game ended in a few moves. Let's see, it's knight takes f5 was just played, knight to e6, trying to slow these pawns down. Knight to d4, of course this is a winning king and pawn endgame, so the knight has to move. It goes knight c5 check, king just runs to e3 away from further checks. Also this knight here is not only blockading this pawn, but it's defending the b pawn, so doing a great job. King comes over to c7, but after a few pawn pushes, king to d6, g4, knight to d7, h4, and black resigned in this position. It's just hopeless. These pawns are going to come through, and there's nothing black can really do to stop them, and then this pawn is securely blockaded. So it's an example of how that that central pawn in the endgame is not nearly as important as it is in the middle game. In the endgame, you want to have pawns on the side of the board, and you want to make life difficult for your opponent that way. Notice also, if the king ever runs over here to stop these pawns, this knight can hop into c6 and gobble up the pawns on the other side of the board. So it's probably still important to have pawns on both sides of the board in order to make this a endgame win. Okay, let's take a look at the next game. Okay, this is a game between Alexander Tolush and Alexei Sokolsky. played in the USSR Championship in 1950. Toulouche, by the way, was a very aggressive attacking player, an interesting player. And Sokolsky has the Sokolsky opening named after him with the b4, also called the orangutan opening. Anyway, interesting players. Let's go up to move 9 again, where we get the isolated queen's pawn position. The same position that we saw in the previous games. And watch how the game comes forward from here. In this position, knight to c6 was played, so we're getting a different plan, not this b6 plan. Bishop to g5 still. Bishop to e7. Cancel that. The bishop drops back to e7. So in this position, Black decided he didn't want to trade for the knight here, but just wanted to bring the bishop back and break that pin. The queen comes up to d3, knight to a5, harassing this bishop. The bishop goes to b5, not wanting to trade itself off. White would like to keep the bishop pair, if possible, in this open position. Bishop goes to d7, knight to e5, but it seems like there's no way to keep it, so we get this trade. Bishop takes, queen takes. But he didn't trade it for a knight, he traded it for another bishop, so he doesn't give Black the bishop pair advantage either. a6, kicking the queen. Queen drops back to e2, and knight to d5. So now this knight is securely blockading the d-pawn, and there's a threat to trade off this bishop. White decides to keep the bishop, even though, as I said before, this bishop is not the best bishop in this structure all the time. But let's see what kind of role it plays later in the game. Rook to c8, grabbing the open c-file. Rook a to d1, putting the rook behind the d-pawn. Knight to c6, bishop to c1. So bishop to c1, it had to stop at d2 to stay out of the way of the rook, so the rook could be brought into the game, and then it drops all the way back to c1, so it's not in anybody's way. The rooks can look out on the game without being blockaded by the bishop. So after this exchange, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, we get Black has managed to weaken this, create this backward c-pawn without having to give up the bishop. So he managed to keep his dark squared bishop and trade a knight there and create this pawn structure. And now he's going to play against it with the move b5. So this is going to prevent White from pushing that pawn forward and getting the hanging pawns. And so this pawn will definitely become a weakness, and Black will try and pile up against it. Okay, so rook to d3 was played with the idea of defending, but also with the idea of attacking. And this is what makes this game kind of interesting to look at, kind of a novel placement of the pieces. The queen came forward to d5, got knight to g4, rook f to d8, coming to the center, rook to g3, and b4. Now just busting up these pawns, not waiting to be asked, or not just piling up pressure, not content to just pile up pressure on the c3 pawn, just push that b pawn forward and try and destroy these central pawns of White right away before they become an issue. But he must have miscalculated a little something over here on the king side, because there's a dangerous lineup of pieces. and so White, Toulouche, just ignores the attack on his c-pawn here and plays knight to h6 check. Of course, it's pinned, so it's pinned, so the king can't, the pawn can't take the knight. The king went to f8 here, and now the terrific sacrifice here. Rook takes g7. So just an amazing looking sacrifice. You rarely see. When I was doing the Attack the King series, there were lots of knight sacrifices and bishop sacrifices down here, but not so often do you see that rook sacrifice on g7. So after king takes g7, queen g4 check. And where can the king go? Actually, if it goes to the back rank, he gets mated. So that's the problem here. And the bishop is defending the knight on h6. So those are the key issues here. He's forced to block with the bishop. And now, instead of immediately recapturing the bishop, which he could do with a pawn push, well, he recaptures the bishop this way. I was sort of saying that wrong. He pushes the c-pawn over here, kicking the queen. So he left that c-pawn hanging, under threat from the b pawn while he started this kingside attack, and then at this critical moment he throws his pawn in to harass the queen. And now the queen can take on d4, but that loses the bishop with check. So now he's not down a whole rook, he's just down the exchange. And the king runs to f8 to avoid getting mated, and get mated on h8. And now this bishop comes into e3, harassing the queen. The queen comes back to h8 to try and defend. And, this is a long game, so the king gets chased all around. But basically, this is a strong enough attack that it's just winning for white. Let's see, I'll play through it just to see if there's some nice finish here. But we end up in this position where actually the material is even. He's gotten the exchange back. I see 5 pawns against 5 pawns. Yeah, material balance, but white is still attacking. The king is not finding any safe shelter. And after a few more moves, queen a1 check, f6, and knight here. Black resigned at this point. The material is still even, but there's too many threats. The queen can come in here. Actually, the threat here, that's a misleading arrow. Let's erase that. So see if you can spot the threat from white here. Nice little tactical finish. Okay, the threat from white is queen to f8, which is checkmate. Check along that diagonal is mate, and there's no way for black to stop the queen from going to that square. And the king has no moves. The knight is guarding these light squares. The pawn is guarding that dark square. The king can come back. This is actually the only move, and if black were to play on, that's what he has to do to survive. But after that, this queen can come in here with check and pick up a piece. If there isn't a mate over here, at least win a piece. So that's why black resigned at this point, and kind of a nice finish. Okay, let's take a look at the next game. The next game I wanted to look at was between Tigran Petrosian and Georgy Ilevitsky. This was played in 1951 at the semifinal of the USSR Championship. So let's zoom ahead to move 9 again, where we get the isolated queen's pawn position. You see this knight c6 move again. And now a3 kicking the bishop, and the bishop goes back. So we don't get this trade on c3, but we get the knight left here, and the pawn stays isolated. So the rook goes to the open file. b6 is played now. Bishop to a2. So Petrosian is keeping his bishop on this diagonal, and it'll play an interesting role in the game from that position. So pay attention to that bishop. So bishop to b7 here. Now the other bishop comes out to f4. Rook to c8, putting the rook on the open file. Queen to d3. And knight to b8. So the knight is looking to reroute, although actually it never manages to go anywhere in this game because something happens shortly. Knight g5, already trying to stir up some trouble on the queen side. It seems like white's setup is, black. Seems like black's setup is a little bit slow, and white is being very active already. Now maybe black was counting on this move, bishop a6, hitting the queen and trying to force it back. But what Petrosian does is very interesting in this position, and something that's kind of typical. Sometimes you really don't care about that pawn. Sometimes you push it forward not in order to trade it off, but just to give it away. And sometimes you give it away just by leaving it there, and that's what Petrosian does here. He uses this chance to switch his queen, to move his queen over to the king side, and he has some dangerous-looking pressure against h7 and just leaving this pawn up for grabs. So Ilevitsky doesn't see any reason not to grab the pawn. And now another tempo with the rook coming out to harass the queen, taking advantage of the fact that the knight can't take the rook, otherwise there's a mate there. So this knight is tied down to that spot, defending against the mate threat. So the queen has to move. The rook maneuvers to e3, and the queen goes back, but basically white got a free move, got that rook left in for free. And now another free move Well, this bishop is under attack. It's not a free move exactly. What he's doing is he's getting rid of this bishop with tempo. He trades it off for that knight, so that knight never made it out of the b8 spot. Rook takes. And the reason he did that is he had spotted a tactical idea here. So if you want to see if you can spot the idea. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. What Petrosian played right here is knight takes f7. And, well, that knight just can't be taken. If you play king takes, then this is horrible. This is, let's see, it's mate. If the king goes back here, it gets mated, and you don't really want to play your king there. There's some more checks. I guess there's no immediate mate if the king goes there, but at the very least, white is getting his piece back, and he's got a terrific attack against the exposed king as well. And the other way of taking that knight would be with the rook. If rook takes, queen takes is also a threat. Notice now this bishop on a2 is, we're just threatening to take that rook. And if the other rook comes over to defend, white can actually grab the bishop because now there's a pin on that rook, and the bishop is undefended. So once again, white gets his material back, and maybe more, because it looks like he's going to win the exchange shortly, and continue with the attack. So it's not even safe to take that knight there. Ilovitsky played bishop to c4 here, and after a couple moves, let's see, rook d1, chasing the queen away. The queen ran to c5, and bishop takes c4, trading off on that diagonal and bringing the knight back to g5. This game went on a long time, so I don't want to go through the whole game, I guess. But white just has a winning attack at this point, and black's remaining pawn. Actually, the pawns are even because white sacrificed a pawn and then got it back on f7, and this pawn is about to fall. Although there are probably more active moves than just grabbing that pawn. Anyway, it looks like a winning position for white, and Petrosian went on to win a nice game. In fact, it had a really peculiar endgame. Maybe I'll just zoom ahead to show you the endgame, where he had a bunch of pawns. Yeah, here we are. I guess after the final exchange of pieces, we got this configuration where we had a queen and 4 pawns against a knight, and Petrosian managed to win that endgame. So pretty interesting game. Okay, let's take a look at the last game for this video. This is a game played between Jan Donner and Predrag Ostojic, and it was played in Vaikanzi in 1969. So let's get up to the move 9, the same position that we've seen before. We see the move b6 here from Ostojic, and rook e1. So familiar territory so far. Bishop b7, bishop to d3. So the bishop drops back, positions itself on this diagonal. Knight b to d7, bishop d2. So the other bishop comes out, defending the knight. Rook to c8, putting more pressure on the c file. Queen to e2, rook to e8, putting the rook here, rook a to d1, getting the rook behind the d-pawn, bishop to f8. The bishop just drops back, decides it doesn't want to trade itself off for the knight, and sets up for a defensive job over here. Also, notice it had to wait for the rook to get over to the e8 square before it could come back. So you could think of that as a kind of a maneuver where you bring the knight out, you bring the bishop out, castle, move the rook out of the way, and bring the bishop back. It actually happens quite a lot. So a3, preventing any pieces from landing on the b4 square. Queen c7, and knight to e5. Another advantage of the isolated queen's pawn is that it supports this advanced knight on e5. And the reason why I wanted to show this game is it shows one more type of transformation that can occur in the position, which is that Ostojic decided at this point to trade off that knight, and white took back with the pawn. Jan Donner took with the pawn, and this is a very dangerous pawn here. Actually, it prevents the knight from staying on the this f6 square, so it weakens this king side quite a bit. Now he did bring the bishop over here to defend, but we'll see this becomes an issue in the game. The knight comes out to d5. and white just trades that off. Bishop takes, not wanting to take with the pawn and create some weaknesses here, and the opportunity for the e-pawn to come forward now. So rook to c1, hitting the queen. Queen drops back to b8, and h4, just going directly for that king side attack, having chased white's piece or black's pieces back somewhat and gotten an advanced pawn on e5. Let's see if this is enough of an advantage to get a breakthrough attack. So first, black tries to relieve some of the pressure by trading a pair of rooks, and then he brings this rook to d8. This may, well, it's just more active on that open file there. It looks like the e file is going to stay closed now. Bishop goes to g5 and hits the rook. The rook goes over to c8 now, and h5, just pushing on with the h-pawn. So the queen runs the corner with a8, and the idea of this is to line up and threaten to take the pawn on g2. But, well, white has a nice answer with queen g4, bringing the queen out, looking at the king side, and defending the pawn on g2. Now, notice that even though bishop to h6 is possible, that pawn is defended, so it's not really a threat at this point. Instead, well, let's see, it's black's move here. Black played queen to b7, setting up a second-rank defense too, possibly. And now rook to e3, lifting the rook, so just bringing more pieces to bear, although opening up the back rank. And in fact, this is white's last chance, This is black's last chance to kind of save things here. He could play h6 and give up a pawn here. h6, bishop takes, and then rook to c1 check, driving the rook over here, driving the king to h2, and then bishop takes g2, getting a pawn back this way with some clever kind of tactic. You see, if the queen takes here, then the queen trade comes with a tempo, because that's with check, and then he'll be able to grab the bishop here. But white's not obliged to take that. Is not obliged to take that position, and can try other moves like rook to g3 here. Looks like an interesting try. But it looks like this is a position where black can maybe hold on for a bit longer than what happened in the game. So in the game, let's go back to that. In this position, he played g6 instead of h6. And after that, it's really all over. So one little misstep. Black starts with this bishop f6 move. You know, this pawn on e5 has weakened all of these dark squares and supports the bishop there, so it's going to be hard to chase away. The queen comes over to c7, maybe looking for counterplay on the c file. And now there's this trade, h takes g, f takes g, and then bishop takes. And black just resigned here. There's no way to stop the attack. If the pawn is taken, if the bishop is taken, then queen takes check. The bishop blocks with g7. And now the killer move here is rook to c3. The queen is really stuck here. It needs to defend that bishop, because otherwise white is crashing through with the mate. And if it steps aside to get out of the way, then the rook is coming to the back rank with check, and that forces actually mate here. If the king moves, the bishop is pinned. The king has no moves, and if the queen takes, then we have queen takes bishop. So rook to c3 there is game over. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave any comments you have in the section below, and I will be back soon with some more of the isolated queen's pawn. See you then. Bye.